Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Higher ed scholars and faculty are nearly unanimous in their agreement. The job of being a college or university president today is as difficult as ever. With stressors from finances to enrollment and statewide politics, every day is a new adventure. For those whose presidencies are in states like Florida and Texas, the pressures on both presidents and trustees from governors and legislatures is even higher. My guest today studies higher education from a policy and governance perspective. Michael S. Harris is a professor of higher education and chair of the Department of Education Policy and Leadership in the Simmons School of Education and Human Development at Southern Methodist University. He will serve as the SMU Faculty Senate President and Faculty Representative to the Board of Trustees during the 2023-2024 school year. His primary research interests consider the culture, strategy, and behavior of higher education institutions. Michael and I have a wide-ranging conversation about athletics, politics, and faculty oversight, and discuss his upcoming leadership role leading the Faculty Senate at Southern Methodist, while throwing in a few thoughts on what a future in the Pac-12 might look like for SMU. Michael, I'm so glad you could join us for the podcast today. How are things in Texas?
Texas is good. We're not to the heat of the summer, so we're good. So it's good to be here with you today.
Absolutely. So you and I share a background at the University of Pennsylvania. You got your master's and doctorate here. Now you're at Southern Methodist University, which, in some ways, the state of Texas, the state of Florida are really representing some challenges for leadership in higher education. And we think of athletics being the main center of the universe, but it's really not when it comes to some of the other issues that college campuses face. A few weeks ago, you were quoted in an Inside Higher Ed article about what college presidents in Florida are facing. Give our listeners just a sense of what that article was about.
Sure. So there's a number of states that are facing political challenges. And for me, I think there is no tougher job than being a public university president in these states. And I think Florida, I think Texas, there's some others are really at the front lines of these fights about really the future of higher ed, the mission of higher ed, the values of higher ed. And so the premise of the piece that you reference in many ways was trying to understand why presidents aren't being more forceful and more public in defense of their values and mission. And so there was really this question about there's been really not a lot of pushback from presidents, and why might that be? And for me, I think there are some valid, real concerns about if you, particularly if you're the only one to do it, right? If you stick your neck out there, not only could it threaten your own role and presidency, but could really threaten your institution. I mean, in Florida, we have to look any farther than the fight with Disney to see what happens and the ways that right now, certain governors and legislators, and DeSantis is certainly one of these, are willing to kind of go after people who disagree with them. And so while I understand the reticence for presidents to stand up and kind of be a forceful advocates in this situation, at the same time, I think if you're going to be in these roles, you have to be willing at the end of the day, when your core values are threatened, you have to be willing to stand up, even if that means kind of losing your presidency. So I think that's, for me, I understand the challenge in the residents, and I really think, gosh, who wants those jobs these days, right? I mean, I think it's a real challenge in some of these states. But it's, I think as higher education faculty and leaders and certainly presidents, if we're not going to stand up, who will? And so that's for me at the end of the day where we've really got to turn this thing around, because this is not just an ancillary threat. These are core threats to fundamental values that our institutions hold.
You referenced Florida. One particular institution, the new university, has gotten very much a lot of press about basically their board being taken over. And yesterday, I believe I saw that they denied tenure to five members of the faculty. So the board is now inserting themselves into decisions that traditionally have been the province of the board themselves. But one of the things you said in the higher ed article was there's a clear political fear that if presidents stand up in support of the values for their institutions, if they contradict the governor and or the powerful friends that he or she has in the legislature, that they themselves are threatened. And so that really leaves higher ed leadership at a moment in time, and you just mentioned it earlier. We have a lot of presidential turnover. One of the things that I've noticed is that in the Big Ten Conference, which is arguably one of the most high profile academic and athletic conferences in the country, there's been, of the 14 schools, 12 presidencies have turned over in the last 18 months. So as somebody who studies leadership, who focuses on policy and the influence that politics can have, what might you recommend as safety nets and strategies where presidents could shore up their support for the position they're arguing?
The American Council of Education survey of college presidents came out recently and saw the continuation of this trend about the average tenure of presidents continuing to decline. Yeah. As problematic as I think that is and can be, what I'm almost more concerned about are the number of presidencies that are ending in what in some of my research I've called involuntary turnover. Mm-hmm. That is a president who was either fired or forced out of office. Whether they said in the press release, so I'm going to spend more time with my family, we all know they were forced out of office. And I think that is such a damaging, traumatic experience for an institution, not only to go through that, but the implications it has for your search for a successor. So this is really profoundly damaging to the institution. And so, we know this is occurring. And I think what strikes me the most as having looked at this over the last 20 years, how much in the last 5 or 6 years the increase of involuntary has been around things such as board dysfunction, around partisanship, right? These issues that if we were looking at 20 years ago, there'd be one or two, but it would be blips. They would be highly unusual cases.
Right.
Now it's becoming much more common in instances where you're having multiple presidents leave for this reason, because the board is not able to do its basic fiduciary responsibilities. I think Michigan State as an example, right, and relatively recent history where that board was essentially not able to function, and in some ways, in my take, the president said, "I have no confidence in you and your ability to lead this institution, so I can't lead it if you can't lead it." So, to me, that is a profound challenge facing higher ed right now, and that if you don't have a functioning board, you've got a president who's not going to be successful, right? We know this. This is not news. I think what's shocking though is how frequently these turnovers are happening, how boards are now just seemingly at the drop of a hat willing to let a president go. I worry about the pools of presidents and doing searches right now and the quality of those pools. And I think what that leads to that's a long-winded way to get back to your question. I think the job for the presidency now, for my money, is as difficult as it's been at any time in recent memory. 10 years ago, I might have said it's a hard job, but it's not any harder than it has been. I think it's hard to look at the current state of things, whether that's partisanship in politics, whether it's athletics, governance, economic issues, labor issues, hiring. I mean, it's seemingly, when you look across the board, we've got nearly unprecedented challenges in nearly every aspect of where a president needs to lead institutions. And it does make it a little hard to say what should a president do? Because you've got the proverbial, you're sticking your finger in the dikes and you're running, you're springing leaks and you're out of ways to plug those holes. And so I think it's really hard to be able to point to a presidency and say, well, here's your to-do list. If you can take care of these 2 or 3 things, you'll be in pretty good shape. Now it's, well, gosh, maybe you've got athletics under control, maybe you've got your board under control, and then you've got a governor comes in that blows up the whole thing. Right. Or maybe you manage your legislature, but then your faculty say something that gets the legislature hyped up and coming after your institution. So it's, I don't want to say it's an impossible job, but gosh, it sure seems like at this point, it's hard to see how you could be successful And in some ways, I think some of our smart provosts and deans are saying, I'll stay here. I don't want that job. I can make a difference here. Why would I jump into that frying pan?
And it's something that I worry about too. Of course, teaching in the exec doc program, which has produced over 60 college presidents in its span, you hear these leadership conversations all the time because people believe they can make a difference in the presidency, but with all these headwinds, it feels like all you're doing is swatting down, foul balls and trying to figure out which way is home plate.
Right.
You mentioned athletics, and since this podcast is about athletics, let's talk about it. Presidents at large schools and even mid-sized schools are under tremendous pressure to use athletics as a real exposure and relevance and credential kind of guide for their institution. It says that there's something if they're Division I, right? It just kind of gives them credence that they might not get, from research or other kinds of things. But there's this tremendous push to become Division I, and then the question I ask is, then what? Once you've reached that pinnacle, you've moved from Division II to I, or you move from an FCS conference to an FBS conference. They never seem to have an answer for then what. And that's something that I'd really love to get your take on, because it is a leadership decision to try to celebrate the big move to Division I. But once you get there, there doesn't seem to be a plan. What are your thoughts?
So, I've said to students in class before, no president wants to stand up and say, I'm for the status quo, right? I'm here to, let's just keep doing what we're doing, right? Whether that's athletics and moving up in conference or moving up in success of teams, whether that's research, right? Nobody says, oh, we're a research university, now we're good to stay here. We've got to do something more. And in some ways, that's probably the natural progression of the way higher ed works, right? We want to maximize revenue, we want to maximize prestige, and that's the name of the game we're all in. And as a result, you can never achieve that, right? There's no endpoint where you go, we've made it, we're done.
Right.
And so you are at this constant, it's a constant challenge. I think that is, in some ways, the interesting, fun part of higher ed leadership. There is always something next. You really are never resting on your laurels. But it does beg the question of, to me, what is a realistic goal? And so, if we think about conference realignment, for example, sure, everybody wants to be Power 5. And if you're not going to be Power 5, you want to be whatever the best conference you can be in. And there's lots of logical reasons for that, right? Both revenue, academics, prestige, right? There's lots of potential benefits. But what I worry about from a broader higher education system standpoint is the cost of those decisions. So, right, we know this, right? Athletic programs outside of that select few are not going to make money. But how much is too much to lose, right? I don't feel like we have those conversations. Right? If there's some subsidy that needs to come over from academics to athletics, okay, maybe there's a good reason for that, for, as you mentioned, the benefits of having legislators to campus, the benefits to campus culture, student life, right? There are some reasons that we might want to invest in these things, even if we don't get a traditional return on investment that we can point to dollars and cents. I'm right up the road from TCU, right? They're certainly right now saying, gosh, given the run that we had in football, look at how great that investment is. Is it truly financially going to make sense for them in the long run? Probably not.
Yeah.
But we don't ever say at what cost, right? Because there's always this allure of the next thing. And that's true, by the way, not just in athletics. I think that's true when we talk about the research enterprise, right? Yeah. As one that outside, again, of some select few, it tends to cost as much or more money than one makes on it. And I think that's the leadership quandary to me, is you need to be able to have those tough conversations with your board, with your faculty, with your leadership team. And even if that's not something we're going to put out publicly and say, hey, we've got a number in mind that we don't want to go our athletics deficit better, greater than this. I just worry those conversations are being had because of this allure of what could happen, right? We could be the next TCU. We could be the next March Madness Cinderella that, right, is the darling for 2 or 3 weeks. But it's the what's next, right? And that's, I feel like from a if I could point to a critique of higher ed leadership writ large, that's the conversation I feel like we've not been very good at having. And we do the same thing as faculty, right? We want more faculty colleagues to be hired. We want more resources. And we don't like it when deans and provosts say, well, I'm not sure that investment will make sense right now, right? We want more, just like presidents and boards want more. It's the nature of higher ed, I guess. But that's those tough conversations, I think, right? If you're the CFO, if you're the president, if you're the board, I think you've got to have those. And I don't know that we always do that as well as we probably could or should.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I think it's one of the things one of my classes studies is consultants reports about, moving up a division or changing conferences or adding football, those big decisions. But once the consultant report is written and the action is taken, where's the look back? Did we do it well? Did we get the goals that we thought we get with enrollment and visibility and student excitement on campus? And that's true of Division 2 and 3. I mean, there's small colleges adding football like crazy right now because they think that's going to be the way to restore the campus spirit. If you were advising some leaders about those strategies, what might you say to them right now?
Yeah, tread cautiously, particularly in this environment, right? I think all of us are, operating with limited sense of what the next 5 to 10 years might look like. I would make the case. I think there is a strong. When I was at Penn, I studied with Doug Thoman, right? Doug was great about making this case around the benefits of intercollegiate athletics to institutional culture and campus life. So I would be remiss if I didn't, to point to those things because Doug would certainly, if he were still with us. But again, let's be smart about those investments and think about targeted investments, just like we would point to target investments in any aspects of strategic decisions we make on campus, and not. I think the other fallacy we can fall in, and I think football is maybe a prime target for this. I don't know that every school needs to be a football school. And I say that in Texas, and that will probably get me run out of the state. But I think there's a lot of schools that would be much better off as basketball schools, right? And look more like an East Coast school in some ways. But it just, everybody feels like we got to have a football team. We're not a real university if we don't have one, especially in certain parts of the country. So I think that's the challenge that you've got to try to hold back against. But I also think realistically, right, if you're a president and your board and your alums are saying, we want a football team, this is something we're missing. I can also understand why that's not necessarily a hill you want to die on either. And so then let's figure out how we can make that make sense for our campus. So when I first got to SMU back in 2012, Larry Brown was the head basketball coach, and there was a lot of excitement around SMU basketball. The arena had been redone, and but the campus didn't have a culture around everything from as simple as how do we get students and tickets, because there was never really much of a demand for it. And how do we coordinate cheers so that they're not the most vulgar cheers that sometimes undergraduates can come up with, and how we can maybe steer in the right direction. And it's one of those conversations of like, let's how do we kind of gear this to a productive culture and climate on campus. And that's, to me, part of this debate that one has to have is if we're going to do these things, maybe they don't always make the most financial sense, but let's make sure we're getting the other benefits out of them, and have, to the extent you can, have the tough conversation. Maybe we don't need this many sports. Maybe we don't need football. Maybe, we don't need some of, everything that the big schools are able to afford based off of the reality of their conferences and TV contracts and the like, right? I think that's, it's, again, easy to point to and say, well, this is what everybody has. This is what we need to. And that's just obviously not smart strategic decision-making.
Yeah, and so much of the media revenues have driven the decision-making that has happened around particularly football, but sometimes basketball, sometimes facilities, right? But part of that is also a president's job to oversee the kind of the vision for the campus, the footprint of the campus, and where it goes. One of the things that I've noticed in my research is this trend towards building athletics facilities or villages on the edge of campus, because number one, there's usually more land, but number two, it then creates sort of a one-stop place for the athletes to be. Do you think the president should be concerned about that sort of separation of the culture from the rest of the campus versus athletics? I mean, structurally, it makes sense, but what are some of the other issues you might face?
It does make sense structurally and from a plant standpoint. I really worry about this, and I'm going to connect it with another thing that we're all talking about right now, and that's the transfer portal.
Yeah.
I really worry about the segregation, and I use that word intentionally, of our student athletes and our general student population. And I worry that the transfer portal may be only making this problem more difficult, in that we have students that are going to multiple institutions, right? They're not coming through the traditional orientation processes. They're not coming into campus and getting, used to the flow of campuses, the flow of classes, the expectations for the institution academically. And so, I worry if we've got residence halls that are off on the side, and we've got training centers off to the side, and we've got our practice fields off to the side, and we have these large stadiums and things that are off to the side. And we've got students that maybe only to campus for a year or two before they move to another one. That all of a sudden, not only does that present some of the challenges we've all talked about around the athlete experience, but does it then become an athlete experience and not a student athlete experience? And we could have a debate whether that was ever a reality or not. I sometimes think it was more of an ideal than a reality. But I do worry that the clustering in majors and those things that we've worried about over the years, that the current reality of NIL, of the transfer portal, of all of these elaborate facilities, players' lounges, all those kinds of things, just do more and more to divide student athletes from the general student population. And that's something that I know many of my faculty colleagues worry about. Even as somebody who enjoys watching sports, I worry sometimes. I mean, is it really now, even more than it ever was, really just a semi-pro experience as an appendage to the campus? And the more and more we have these things separate, I just worry about that reality, and particularly the academic success of these students, and the extent to which we're not doing their academic careers a service by having the physical plant, the structures, the academic realities. It's a worry of mine for sure.
Yeah, and I so remember the quote that LSU quarterback Joe Burrow made as he was leaving college athletics and going to the pros. Said, "Yeah, I'd like to visit sometime. All my classes are online, so I don't know what campus looks like." You get this isolationism, and particularly in football, because these facilities are built to be football only facilities.
Yes.
And so to the coach, they see that as a great opportunity to create team bonding and team culture, but culture can go multiple ways. So it does allow for other ideas to be inserted into the mix. Does that concern you at all?
It does. And I think this is also, we probably have not talked enough about the COVID implications of this. So when we got used to those campuses that had students that were online and in person, well, we were not in that very long before people started saying, hey, here's a solution to our athletes missing class. We can just Zoom them into class. We got the technology. We've put all this investment in. Look, we've just solved this huge problem that we haven't been able to figure out with schedules and practice schedules and team travel schedules. Look, piece of cake. Now they can be in class. Well, I think all of us who also lived through COVID know that is not the same academic experience.
Right.
Not even close.
Yeah.
And so, I worry yet again that we've set up this system that, in some ways provides a second tier education, be it fully online classes or kind of this ability to Zoom into class or watch a recording of class or whatever it might be. And that's just not the educational experience that we would say is acceptable for the vast majority of our students, and it shouldn't be acceptable for our student athletes either.
Yeah, it seems to be sort of like the lowest common denominator is what will work for us in athletics, because the more important energy is devoted to practice, competition, watching video, doing analytics, working on your brand. All of those things seem to be equal with the educational experience. And we were just talking about this in class the other day. We were talking about athletic academic advisors and the tremendous pressure that gets put on them to try to balance what the athlete would like to do with their life and what the coach wants the athlete to do while they're there. Have you had much interaction with folks who do that world? And if so, what's your takeaway from that?
We've had some students in our program that have been in those roles. And the other thing that we've talked about some on our campus is also mental health counseling, facing some of these same challenges, right? So I do think it is a challenge that has only gotten more difficult. I think, again, coming post-COVID, because it is easy, to your point, we have other paths to the academics that we didn't have 3 or 4 years ago.
Right.
And so, it is a say, oh, well, the team's gone an extra day. Again, we'll be in the hotel, you can Zoom in, or you can Zoom into your professor's office hours, because that's an option they provide now. And again, we learned the hard way that there is a benefit to that in-person interaction. And so, I think anything that's diluting that is a problem. And that's the sense I've gotten, both a concern about the academics, but just, right, this, I'm by no means an expert in this space whatsoever, but the concerns around mental health issues, particularly post-COVID, and particularly for our African American Black student athletes, right, in particular. So I think that's the other space where I think all of us are going to have to do some serious soul searching, and also find resources to make sure that we can fill those gaps. Because if you're struggling there, we're not going to get the first base academics or athletics, right? And so I think that's a challenge we're going to have to, people more expert than me are going to have to figure out. But it's something that I think is certainly hindering some of our academic success coaches, advisors, professors, right? It's a campus-wide problem, but I think it's particularly acute in our student athlete population.
Yeah, I really share your concern about that, having worked in Division I athletics and traveled with teams. It's boggling to me how they manage their time. Absolutely boggling to me. And so I have to ask, because SMU has been in the discussions about possibly being a part of the Pac-12. And I know there's very little that you can say specifically about it, but just talk about it in relation to the travel. Because certainly USC and UCLA right now are going to be facing some significant travel issues coming to the Midwest and the East Coast as part of the Big Ten. What are your thoughts on that? How should presidents make a decision that could be lucrative, although I'm not 100% sure it's going to be lucrative because of the media rights, but also it appears to be a step up in stature?
Sure. I mean, you can see us, to allude to our earlier part of the conversation, right? There's obvious prestige and revenue rationales to make a move like that. I mean, that said, in our particular case, not like the American conference is geographically, small by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, right.
So in some ways, we face those travel issues now. I think for me, and this is a hard thing, I think, for presidents to do. This is where you're also going to have to trust your faculty. And talk to your faculty really openly around things like how many missed classes are too many. Yeah. Now, faculty will all say, right, you can't miss any. Right. But what are the realistic lines, and what does that mean for travel schedules, right? And what is the oversight of travel schedules? I mean, some of these are really key questions, and that's not just your faculty athletics representative, right, or an athletics council, right, what you might have. You've got to talk to the faculty on the ground. Who's teaching general chemistry? Who's teaching writing? And talk to those faculty and see, right, some of our student athletes, given the nature of their schedules, they're less impacted than others. But I think we need to have some open conversation around this. And SMU is not unique in this, right? Nor are most of the schools that are in these discussions. That's not a front consideration, right? You've got broader considerations about your institutional prestige and revenue and your athletic programs and what that means for the broader institution. But I think at the same time, having some of these conversations, especially with faculty, can either mitigate problems, right? That may be, the nature of the beast with these super conferences as we're obviously moving towards. And thinking about ways that we can ensure that the students can still have academic support, academic success, and fulfill their obligations and interest in their respective sports. And that faculty piece, I feel like too often is either shunted to a faculty athletics representative or a small handful of people who might be involved. But it's got to be a broader faculty conversation. Faculty senates need to be involved. Department chairs, right? You've got to get the people that are really on the ground and have a sense of what is really happening, and how do we make this work in a way that fulfills the broader institutional objectives, but also preserves the academic rigor and integrity.
So you're going to be chair of SMU's Faculty Senate next year?
I am.
Yes.
I've not convinced somebody to take it off my hands yet, so it's going to happen.
You got to keep working at that. Do you have intents of maybe asking to try to implement a system just like that at SMU? Would that be something you'd like to take on?
It's one of the conversations we've been having, even this year around travel schedules and oversight. I mean, that's and for one of the conversations that we have, and I think these are healthy conversations, what's the appropriate governance role of faculty over athletics? And especially at a school like SMU, right? There's long legacies, sometimes not good ones, around governance and things, for example, in our case, that developed post-death penalty, that's tried to strengthen the governance and oversight of athletics. But I think for me, faculty governance is really important. The whole reason I agreed to run for the office. I believe in faculty governance. I'm a little bit of a sucker, corny in that way. I think it is important. And that doesn't mean faculty have say over everything that happens on campus, right? It is shared governance. We all share in the decision making. But I think whatever happens with SMU's conference, and I have no idea one way or the other. I suspect nobody truly does what's going to happen a year or 2 years from now. I think we as faculty need to be engaged. I remember I was in a faculty meeting, or faculty senate meeting, 6 or 8 years ago now, and someone was lamenting the commercialization of intercollegiate athletics, and the debate goes on for a few minutes, and I finally had to stop and say, no, we're not all familiar with this, but this has been true since the history of intercollegiate athletics, right? This is not a new thing that just happened, right?
Have you heard of the Carnegie Report?
Exactly. And in fairness, right, many of my colleagues who are in other disciplines, they don't look at these things the way you or I do. And so there are, I think, education that we need to do around athletics, and I think that means, and our athletic director here has been good about this, it means getting the athletic director in front of the faculty senate. And sometimes he gets tough questions that I suspect he would rather not have to face around things like the athletic department deficit or student athlete time away from class. But you've got to have those conversations, both in large public forums, but also in smaller, smaller group settings. Because that's faculty have to be involved in these discussions, and clearly presidents, trustees, athletic directors, they're the ones that are primarily making a lot of these decisions. But we need structures in place for faculty to have input and insight and understand, right? And that doesn't always mean that we as faculty will agree with the decisions that might be made. But I firmly believe that higher education makes better decisions when we are engaged in the governance process. And as we all know, governance is messy and it's not pretty, and it's slow and arduous, and the meetings can be torturous at times. But I truly do think we make better decisions. And I think that's true in the athletic space as much as it is anywhere on campus.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I also think that the institutions that have forsaken their governance process, their shared governance process, are the ones that find themselves in quite the pickle sometime when they're trying to decide, why should we give $4 million every year to athletics just to subsidize them? You know, those questions may not come about if there's been regular, consistent messaging and interaction with faculty where they wouldn't feel like they're so far out of the loop.
Right. And make the case, right? If you're going to make the case, to use your example, that we're going to subsidize to a tune of $4 million, make the case why that's the right decision. You're not going to convince everybody, but make the case. Here are the benefits that we see, the benefits to the institution, the benefits to campus life. And sure, as faculty, you may wish we spent that money somewhere else, but make your case. I think too often higher education leaders can fall into this trap of, well, the faculty are just going to be mad, right? They're not going to like it.
Yeah.
They don't like athletics, right? Whatever. I have many colleagues who adore the student athletes that they have in class, that enjoy going to sporting events, bring their families, right? That's part of the campus culture that we like as much as the students. And I think it's, we do a disservice to the enterprise if we don't have those tough conversations. And again, it doesn't mean we're going to get to consensus. That's not going to happen on these questions. But we're better off for the conversation. I truly do believe.
I agree with that. So in wrapping up our conversation today, I wanted to ask you if you could, have 5 potential presidential leaders in front of you, soon to be presidential leaders. What kinds of advice would you give them about managing college athletics today?
Well, first, and I will give a plug to you, you've got to learn about these issues. So whether that's going to a program like the one you have at Penn, whether that's talking to mentors and other presidents, you've got to learn, because this is an enterprise that most presidents, if they come through the traditional pipeline, they don't have a lot of experience with necessarily, right? If you're a provost or dean, you don't have a ton of interaction with athletics, certainly not to the extent to which you're going to as a new president. So I think that's number one. Number two, figure out when you need to be involved and when you don't need to be involved. There are certainly issues where you as the president need to be the one directly hands-on, and others where you need to leave that to your athletic director or others to be the primary responsibilities, right? The other question that I think about a lot lately, and one of our doctoral students here, Teresa Parrott, has been doing some research in this space, is what is the role of the board? And one of the questions that came up from some of her dissertation research was whether or not you should even have an athletics committee of the board. And there's pros and cons, right, to whether or not you do that. And so I think thinking about the governance structures, both your board of trustees, your faculty, what are the ways that those structures can help make better decisions, ideally before you need them.
Right.
Right. Because if you're trying to build this thing, when you've already got a crisis or an issue at hand, right, you've already lost the fight in a sense. So talk to your board, talk to your leaders, understand the institutional culture and climate and threshold for communication and dissent and all those kinds of things. But really think about what are the decision-making structures that you need that fit who you are, who your leadership style will be, but also your board and your board's leadership style and who's on the board. And so what are the ways that you can make those processes work for you? And so that to me would be probably the last point is get those decision-making structures before you need them.
Yeah.
Because you're going to need them, right? We know this.
Right.
And so get those in place as quickly as possible so that when you do need to consult, you've got the people and processes in place to do that.
That's great advice, Michael. I know you spent a couple of decades now studying what this should look like and where we can get stronger. And I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me and my listeners about these important issues, because the presidents and athletics are under great scrutiny right now. So how do we do this better? That's one of the reasons I wanted to have you here today. Absolutely happy to do it. And it's one of these questions that a year from now, 2 years from
now may be completely different set of issues.
Correct.
Job
Correct.
security for people like us who talk about and study these things.
That's right.
But it is a maybe more so than any time of recent memory. It's a continually changing landscape.
It really is. Really is. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.